The last known film of Tsar Nicholas II, Emperor of all the Russias. With him are his son and heir, Alexei, and his 4 beautiful daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. On the night of the 18th of July, 1918, the Russian royal family was murdered by Red Guards. The bodies of Alexei and Anastasia have never been found. Many years later, in a remote village in Germany's Black Forest, an eccentric old woman hides her face from the camera. She called herself Anna Anderson, but till the end of her days claimed that she was the Grand Duchess Anastasia, the sole survivor of the slaughter of her family in 1918. Was she Anastasia, or the greatest impostor of the century? In the golden days before the First World War, the Tsar and his wife, Alexandra, board the royal yacht Standard. The Tsarevich Alexei, who suffered from haemophilia, is carried in the arms of a burly servant. For Alexei, the slightest scratch or smallest bump was life-threatening. Nicholas was the absolute ruler of a nation of 130 million people. The Tsar believed that his power came to him directly from God. Nicholas was the little father of his people. But a large army and ruthless secret police force also helped to ensure the divine rule of the Romanovs. The Tsar's teeming empire was so vast that as night fell on its western borders, day was already breaking on the Pacific coast. Between the two lay a continent covering 1/6 of the land surface of the globe. Most of the Tsar's subjects lived on the land, tilling the soil as they had done for centuries. But unrest simmered just below the surface. A revolutionary tide had risen and been quelled in 1905. The privileged elite around the Tsar feared that it would rise again. Such fears did little to disturb the pleasure of holidays aboard the royal yacht. The Tsar and his family lived in an almost hermetically sealed world of their own. Certainly, the children remained blissfully ignorant of the precariousness of that world. One which was to change forever in August 1914, when Europe marched to war. The Russian army, the legendary steamroller, mobilized under its commander-in-chief, Nicholas II. The steamroller lumbered into action. There was much fighting spirit, but pre-war neglect meant that there was not enough equipment to sustain Nicholas's army in the field. A priest's blessing was no match for German machine guns. The war destroyed the Tsar's army, and then his empire. At the beginning of 1917, food riots broke out in St. Petersburg. The old order was falling apart. In March, the Tsar abdicated. Everywhere the symbols of Romanov rule were torn down. The new government, headed by the charismatic socialist Alexander Kerensky, decided to send the Tsar and his family to Tobolsk in Siberia, a traditional place of political exile. Here in the governor's house, the Romanovs and their small retinue would, for the moment, be out of sight and out of mind. The Tsar chopped logs with his children's tutor, Pierre Gilliard. He adopted the name Nicholas Romanov and seemed resigned to his fate. His daughters, whose heads had been shaved after an attack of measles, posed for photographs with their jailers. Their father's authority now extended no further than the nearest century. Alexei found time to play with his spaniel Joy, but time was running out for the Romanovs. During a second revolution in October 1917, Kerensky's government was overthrown by the Bolsheviks, led by the veteran communist Lenin. Five months later, a peace treaty was signed with Germany. In his diary, Nicholas Romanov wrote, "Shame and horror. One war had ended, but another was about to begin." At the end of April 1918, the Romanovs were moved 200 miles west to new quarters in Ekaterinburg, a town on the eastern edge of the Urals. This receipt confirms the handing over of the family of the former Tsar for safekeeping. The Romanovs were confined in a large house owned by a retired engineer, Nikolai Ipatiev. A palisade was thrown around Ipatsiev's mansion, which was given a sinister new name, the House of Special Purpose. In Moscow, the Bolsheviks faced more urgent problems. Civil war was now raging in Russia. Her new rulers had their backs to the wall. Counter-revolutionary armies were advancing on Moscow. But the freeing of the Tsar played little part in their plans. The Romanovs were so discredited that even their friends had written them off. In Moscow, the Bolsheviks toyed with the idea of a show trial for the Tsar. Instead, they reached an agreement with their colleagues in the Urals. The Tsar was to be kept alive only as long as he proved useful to the revolution. If circumstances warranted it, the Tsar, but not his family, was to be executed. It was not long before the circumstances arrived which sealed not only the fate of the Tsar, but also that of his family. Counter-revolutionary forces were closing on Ekaterinburg. The decision was taken to kill the family held in the House of Special Purpose. The man in charge was Yakov Yurovsky, who left behind a detailed description of the execution and the disposal of the bodies. First, Yurovsky chose a burial site in a nearby birch swamp, dotted with abandoned mine workings. He also signed for large quantities of sulfuric acid. On the night of the 16th of July, the Romanovs and their entourage were roused from their beds and taken down to the House of Special Purpose's small, bare basement. There were 11 of them in all, including the Tsar's personal physician, Dr. Evgeny Botkin. Waiting for them was a squad of 11 Red Guards. Yurovsky had organized the killing on a one-to-one basis. Several of the executioners were the worse for drink. Yurovsky gave the order to fire. The Tsar died instantly. The rest went down like targets in a shooting gallery. They were finished off with rifle butts and bayonets. The bayonet work was heavy going, as the girls had sewn jewelry into their undergarments, which blocked the thrusts. In the birch swamp, Yurovsky tipped the corpses down a disused mineshaft. But within 48 hours, he had returned to the wood. The bodies were retrieved and an attempt made to burn them, starting with the two smallest, Alexei and Anastasia. When this failed, Yurovsky buried the remaining 9 bodies at this spot, in the middle of a dirt road. The charred remains of Anastasia and Alexei were buried by their funeral pyres. Ekaterinburg duly fell to the counter-revolutionaries, but several months passed before a thorough search for the bodies of the Romanovs was launched under the direction of a trained legal investigator, Nikolai Sokolov. His searches found bone fragments, jewelry, even Dr. Botkin's false teeth. They must have passed back and forth over the bodies in the road, but they did not find them. The woods were to hold their secret for over 50 years. The counter-revolutionary armies were defeated, and by 1920 the Tsar's empire had passed into the hands of the Bolsheviks. But the romance of the Romanovs and the fog of uncertainty which hung over their deaths exercised a powerful fascination. In the post-war years, a string of sensational newspaper articles suggested that there had been survivors of the massacre. The atmosphere was ripe for royal pretenders to emerge from the darkness which had seemingly swallowed the Tsar and his family. The story moves to post-war Berlin, ravaged by defeat, inflation, and despair. On the 17th of February 1920, a young woman was fished from a Berlin canal, having apparently attempted suicide. She was dressed in the clothes of a working woman. No one knew who she was. She became Fräulein Unbekannt, Miss Unknown. She spent the next 2 years in an insane asylum. One day a fellow inmate remarked upon the likeness Miss Unknown bore to one of the Tsar's children, the Grand Duchess Tatiana. Miss Unknown left the asylum with a new identity, not as Tatiana, but as her sister, Anastasia. She convinced a number of influential Russian émigrés that she was the Tsar's youngest daughter. She had a dramatic tale to tell. She claimed that she was the sole survivor of the massacre in the basement. She had been rescued by one of the firing squad, whom she named as Alexander Tchaikovsky. With Tchaikovsky, she had fled via southern Russia to the Balkans. Then Tchaikovsky had conveniently been killed in a street brawl, but not before she had borne him a son. Abandoning the child in an orphanage, she had made her way to Berlin. The Romanov family was not convinced. The Grand Duke Ernst Ludwig of Hesse-Darmstadt was the Tsarina's brother. He dismissed the claims of Miss Unknown. So did the Tsar's mother, the Dowager Empress Marie Fedorovna. The Dowager Empress's daughter, the Grand Duchess Olga, met Miss Unknown in Berlin and concluded she is not the one she believes. One of Miss Unknown's most devoted champions was Gleb Botkin, the son of the Tsar's doctor, Evgeny Botkin. As a child, Gleb had played with the young Romanovs. When he met Miss Unknown for the first time in 1927, Gleb was struck by her luminous blue eyes, the same color as those of her father, the Tsar. But others who had known Anastasia referred to her grey eyes. Over the years, the color of Anna Anderson's eyes, the shape of her ears, and the deformed foot she shared with Anastasia became the subjects of intense debate among believers and non-believers. The apparent similarity between the ears of the two women came close to converting one of Anna Anderson's doughtiest opponents, Earl Mountbatten of Burma, a descendant of the Grand Duke Ernst. But for every argument in favor of her identity as Anastasia, there seemed to be a counter-argument. Every proof that she was Anastasia seemed to be matched by a niggling inconsistency. Why would Anna Anderson venture only the occasional word in Russian? Anastasia had been taught English, but Anna Anderson's English suggested she had picked it up as an adult.
By this opportunity, I thank all my friends everywhere who have been assisting me in all my troubles all these many years.
Her supporters claimed that this selective amnesia had been caused by blows on the head in the basement at Ekaterinburg. In 1928, 12 members of the Romanov family issued a declaration that Anna Anderson was an impostor. Her protectors claimed that the Romanovs were determined to keep her hands off the lost treasure of the Tsar, lying undiscovered in foreign bank accounts. Like so many other stories which circulated about the Romanovs, the legend of the fabulous wealth awaiting a claimant was itself a myth. When the Romanovs died, they had little left but the jewels which the women had sewn into their clothes. All those who met Anna Anderson attested to the strength of her character. Frail and bird-like, she was given to terrifying tantrums, most of them aimed at her faithful followers. But she was also capable of great charm and vivacity. If she was no more than a working woman, how had she acquired such an intimate knowledge of life at the Romanov court? She continually confounded doubters with small but telling memories of Anastasia's childhood, which only Anastasia herself would have known. As the Grand Duchess Olga observed about her in some bafflement, there are still many strange and inexplicable facts about her not cleared up. Great store was placed on Anna Anderson's recollection that in 1916, in the middle of the First World War, the Grand Duke Ernst had made a secret trip to Russia in an attempt to persuade his brother-in-law, the Tsar, to make a separate peace with Germany. There was some circumstantial evidence, but no documentary proof that the Kaiser had dispatched Anastasia's uncle Ernie on such a mission. But the evidence, as with so much else about the elusive identity of Anna Anderson, remained inconclusive. The doubters wondered why her memory was so selective. No Russian and little or no English, but a host of incidents, large and small, effortlessly recalled. Was she the tool of a group of Russian exiles? Or had she been prepared by the Soviet Secret Service to destabilize émigré circles in Europe and America? Was she an adventuress or a victim? Or really Anastasia? As early as 1926, her enemies had provided Anna Anderson with an alternative identity. Far from being Anastasia, she was a Polish factory worker named Franciszka Szankowska, who had been reported missing in Berlin at about the same time that Miss Unknown had been dragged from the canal. Anna Anderson was identified as Szankowska by the Polish woman's former landlady. A subsequent confrontation with Szankowska's siblings was inconclusive. After the Second World War, Anna Anderson lived in this house in the Black Forest. Throughout her life, she depended entirely on the kindness of strangers, although she often bit the hand that fed her. She survived a series of illnesses, spells in mental institutions, and 2 long court cases in which her followers tried to establish her identity as Anastasia. In the mid-1950s, she was back in the headlines. Ingrid Bergman starred as Anastasia in a movie loosely based on Anna Anderson's life. Hollywood contrived a happy ending. Would there be one for the real Anna? Shortly afterwards, Anna Anderson's supporters launched a legal action in Germany to establish her claim to be the Grand Duchess Anastasia. The case was fiercely contested and dragged on through the courts interminably. It was not until 1970 that the verdict was delivered. It had a familiar ring about it. Not proven. By then, Anna Anderson was living in America. She had married one of her devoted disciples, Jack Manahan, a wealthy and eccentric genealogist from Charlottesville, Virginia. In 1979, a gangrenous tumor was removed from her lower intestine in an operation conducted at the Martha Jefferson Hospital in Charlottesville. Anna Anderson died of pneumonia in February 1984. Had she taken her secret to the grave with her? By the 1970s, the Ipatiev house in Ekaterinburg, now the city of Sverdlovsk, had become a discreet place of pilgrimage for Russian monarchists. In Moscow, the Politburo viewed the phenomenon with some alarm. In 1977, the Ipatiev house was leveled, on the orders of no less a person than Leonid Brezhnev. The orders were carried out by the puzzled local party boss, one Boris Yeltsin. Later, a cross was to be erected on the site. The house had gone, but the bodies in the wood remained in their hidden grave. 2 years later, they were finally uncovered, in conditions of great secrecy. 2 men had found the Romanovs, a local historian, Alexander Avdonin, and Gaily Ryabov, one of the Soviet Union's leading TV personalities. In the political atmosphere of the time, even a man as well known as Ryabov had to remain silent. 2 skulls with significant bullet holes were removed for analysis, and then the remains were carefully reinterred. Ryabov had to wait for 10 years and the arrival of Glasnost to break the story in the Russian magazine Fatherland. In July 1991, the skeletons in the wood were dug up once more. Russian scientific teams, working with foreign forensic experts, established that there were 9 skeletons in the grave. Two skeletons were missing. There is general agreement that one is that of Tsarevich Alexei. But Russian and American scientists, using the latest computer methods to reconstruct the skeleton's facial features, were divided about the identity of the other missing skeleton. Was it the Grand Duchess Anastasia, or was it her sister, Maria? Now the DNA experts stepped in. To provide clinching proof that the bones were those of the Romanovs, samples from the grave were sent for testing to the British Forensic Science Service at Aldermaston. A team led by Dr. Peter Gill demonstrated that the bones from the wood were those of the Romanovs. The link was a blood sample provided by Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, who was a descendant, on his mother's side, of the Tsarina Alexandra. Cold science had cut through the myth and muddle surrounding the killing of the Tsar and his family. They had not survived their imprisonment in Ekaterinburg. Now perhaps they could rest in peace. Russian monarchists greeted the news with solemn memorial services. But there was still the nagging problem of the skeletons missing from the grave. If one of them were that of Anastasia, then might she not have survived the massacre to re-emerge as Miss Unknown? Anna Anderson's dwindling band of supporters readied themselves for a new battle. DNA testing might have provided conclusive proof of the claims of her supporters, but Anna Anderson had been cremated. It is next to impossible to extract DNA from ashes. The problem seemed insoluble. Until it turned out that tissue samples had been preserved after the 1979 cancer operation. There was another legal battle before these samples were released for testing at Aldermaston. The disciples of Anna Anderson held their breath. The results of the tests were announced by Dr. Gill at a press conference held in October 1994. After running through the complex historical and scientific background to the case, Dr. Gill delivered his verdict.
Well, this is a family tree. Here the Tsar and 5 children. And here we trace the maternal lineage of Tsarina Alexandra's sister, Princess Victoria of Hesse, had a daughter, Alice of Battenberg, who had a son, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. Firstly, the samples said to have come from Anna Anderson could not be associated with a maternal relative of the Tsarina or of His Royal Highness Prince Philip.
Dr. Gill was clear. DNA proved that Anna Anderson could not be a Romanov. But if she was not Anastasia, then who was she? One of the missing pieces in the jigsaw of Miss Unknown's life fell into place when the British carried out a DNA test on a blood sample taken from a great-nephew of Franziska Schanskovska. It displayed the same pattern as a tissue sample from Charlottesville. Strands of Anna Anderson's hair also matched the pattern. The laboratory had destroyed the romantic web of memories and personal testimony spun by those who believed Anna Anderson's claims to be the Grand Duchess. She was Schanskovska, the woman who had disappeared at the same time that Miss Unknown was pulled from a Berlin canal. In her lifetime, Anna Anderson was never openly exposed as an imposter. Her supporters, and even many of those who doubted her claim, agreed that she could never have simply acted the part of Anastasia for so long. Perhaps she was so deeply submerged in her belief that she was Anastasia that she assumed her persona. For her supporters, who desperately wanted to believe in the survival of Anastasia, this was enough. But the fascination of Anna Anderson transcends the arguments over her identity. In life and in death, she seems a more complex and compelling figure than the real Grand Duchess could ever have been. Perhaps it was all a strange game. Anna Anderson once told a reporter, "How shall I tell you who I am? You believe it or you don't believe it. It doesn't matter. In no way whatsoever."